All right, if I could get everyone's attention, we're going to go ahead and start the next panel. Yeah, thank you for rejoining us here, and for those in virtual world, we have a great discussion set up for you. The broad theme we're working with today for this panel session is national governments, and just the impacts of cryptocurrency and blockchain on national government, and the reverse of that, national government's impact of those technologies. I'm going to do a brief introduction and then going to be joined by some very distinguished panelists, but just going to run through 2 or 3 slides to kind of frame some of the discussion themes, and then we'll get going and do a panel format. Come on. Perfect. Thank you so much. So just some broad framing of the issue. As I mentioned, the first 2 items that, this is kind of a new issue. Cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and all that revolution got going, I think we're at 12 years ago. And it used to be just a lot of rogue innovators is the phrase I like to use. And, it was largely developed in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But I think these past few years, we're seeing folks like El Salvador and now the US government through provisions in the infrastructure bill where this is becoming a very serious dialogue, much more engaged. So we just want to kind of discuss through some of those themes. What are different countries doing, the impacts of the strategic formation, and largely that means, okay, sorry, just checking here. Go back one more. But so the impact on how that impacts different layers of government and the ways they're rolling out their strategy. Not everyone is going to have the same approach. There are smaller emerging countries that may pursue some paths, and then some other more mature markets, or whatever phrase you want to use. Some of the bigger economic nations might have a different way of approaching this issue. So last, we kind of put the panel together, and I thank them for attending, that we wanted to keep in mind that we have various layers of government that we need to think from. We do have national representatives here. We have folks from municipal, state, and national governments. So when we're talking about this is going to be a little bit of a emphasis on the national government part, but we need to keep in mind that a lot of these things develop from municipalities to the state level, to national level, and then finally the international dynamic. So when we're thinking about these topics, we have to keep in mind the layers of government and all the is this state versus federal, all those different dividing lines and the different government officials involved. Lastly, kind of just speaking to the point I just mentioned is, what are the basic driving forces of some of these decisions that you hear countries like El Salvador and China coming out with the Belt and Road initiatives, and countries like Malta and Estonia really taking the lead in Europe. And now the US is starting to more proactively look in those decisions. So, how are those different sizes of countries, their, goals of economic leadership, capital formation? What are some of those motivating decisions and, the advantages and disadvantages of, being the first to really lead on the issue versus trying to keep up? The last theme is really the 2 driving forces at bay here as we look at this from an international perspective. There's a bit of a competitive component right now where a lot of countries are trying to lead. You can see this with a lot of exchange regulation with countries like Singapore and Switzerland, really trying to push forward and capture these new markets. So there are real motivations and benefits to leading these discussions, and I think you see that right now where certain countries are trying to establish themselves as thought leaders and innovators in this space. But also, we have to realize that a lot of these transactions are they're digital assets that occur over the internet. Jurisdictional lines aren't always clear. So there's also a competitive element here, but we need to make sure that we're being thoughtful and collaborative in some of these efforts, because we don't want to encourage jurisdictional hopping or ambiguity as these large multinational corporations work across jurisdictional lines. So with that, I will introduce my esteemed panel. I consider them all personal friends, and so grateful that they're all here today and join me in this discussion. I guess we'll do I'll introduce, they'll do the walk across, and then we'll get going. First, I'll just take the opportunity to recognize Gerard Daché, really the man, the myth, the legend of this fine event. Gerard and I have been working together for several years, but they truly do a great job, and I'm honored to have some of these discussions with him.
I'm honored for you to be here.
All right. We also have Paul Belzano from, he's a professional staff member on the Committee on Agriculture. So he's one of the thought leaders in the commodities and exchange space. So we're honored to have Paul here. And finally...
Bill, did you say he's a professional housekeeper?
Professional staff member. Oh. My apologies. I think I saw our other panelists run out the door, so there he is, getting water like a true gentleman. We have Silvio Casto with us, who is the founder of Logos Capital and also one of the leaders on a lot of the work that's going on in Miami right now in their crypto leadership. So with that, we'll start and just double check. This should be a live mic. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. All right, sorry, I gotta be able to see everyone here. All right. And sound check yep, okay. And then I'll just pass the microphone to each. I guess we'll kind of start out with Paul here and kind of the time hopping. You've been a professional staff member for a while, working on the Agriculture Committee, and we're around in Dodd-Frank and have seen some serious developments on that. So I'm kind of curious. I know you were around for a lot of the swaps regulation for Dodd-Frank. So I kind of wonder if you could make some parallels for what happened 10 years ago to what's going on right now.
Sure, thanks. Let me start by saying my views are my own, and this is sort of the standard government disclaimer. Don't represent the views of my boss or the other members of the Agriculture Committee. But swaps, I think, is an interesting place to start. It's an asset class that we have brought into regulation since the financial crisis, 2008, and Dodd-Frank. But prior to that, they were sort of largely unregulated, and the government sort of made a choice in 2000 to not regulate swaps. And then prior to that, there was a big fight between the CFTC and the SEC. So we have this asset class in history, right, that is in sort of the same way as crypto, infinitely variable, right? Swaps can represent all manners and be constructed in an infinite number of ways. And there was a fight amongst the financial regulators about what a swap was and sort of whether it should be considered a security or a futures contract subject to the CFTC's regulation. And so it's not the first time we've sort of been through this process of trying to get our arms around what is this thing, what is this asset class, and how should we regulate it. So it was an interesting, fight. We're sort of still mostly done with sort of what is it and where should it be regulated, but we're still trying to unpack sort of all of the rules around how we do it.
Yeah, and I think more folks here are probably have seen some of the things by the SEC in recent years. So I was kind of wondering if you could just lay out some of those jurisdictional lines, what the current, not necessarily how they apply to crypto, but just for the non-crypto sphere and kind of what the dividing line for investment protections between a security and a commodity.
Oh, I will try. Not a securities lawyer, not a lawyer. But Generally, the securities regime is a disclosure regime. So if you want to issue a security, you have to go through a disclosure process with the SEC. And generally, the SEC regulates capital formation, right? So the pooling of assets to be able to accomplish and for investment purposes. The CFTC is, I think, we generally think of those as, we call them risk transfer markets. So markets where one entity has a risk and they would like to transfer it for a price to somebody else. And so futures contracts and swaps enable an exchange of payments which can offset financial risk and other types of risk. Equities markets and securities markets are generally about capital formation, where the CFTC's derivatives markets are generally about risk management, thank you. Risk transfer and risk management for market participants.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful, and I think folks can maybe draw some parallels with what's going on these days. I'll jump to Gerard next, and but before we get to Silvio and get his perspective, kind of just want to get broadly with the Government Blockchain Association. You deal with all layers of government, and this is a very up and coming topic where a lot of regulatory regimes are considering these things for the first time. So this is just a very broad question, but I was wondering, what's been your experience, the pace of teaching and, the knowledge acceleration, like what's that like in your world?
Sure. Well, let me start with a standard disclaimer, right? My views are not my own. They're my wife's, right? Also, I'm noticing that we're like brown, black shoes. So it's almost like we've done this pattern thing. So, but unlike our shoes, the state of blockchain and crypto adoption globally is very, it's not systematic. It's very eclectic. And I was just sharing a story, maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, right before the pandemic hit. I was in a country in Africa. And I was having a conversation with the ICT minister. So ICT is Internet Communications and Technology. And she reports directly to the president. In fact, we were outside the president's office. And we were talking about blockchain. Now, the president had just, he wins every year in a free and fair democratic election. He'd been the president for 38 years at that point. So very loyal population, love him. And she said to me, we're interested in blockchain in all of its applications, except for our voting system. Our election system works just the way we like it. Right? And I would say that you have some places at local, state, national governments where there is a lot of integrity. And you have other places where there's not so much. And in the places where there is integrity, right, you don't really need blockchain. But that's going to be the easiest place to implement it, and mostly at the local levels, right? The places where it is very corrupt, it's going to be very hard to implement blockchain, but that's where you need it. So my recommendation is for business owners and politicians and policymakers is try to find the easy spots. Implement blockchain in those places, get the advocates in those places, right? Talk to a guy like Mark Stewart from Chandler, Arizona, right, where they're positive. And look, this is still a very brand new technology with lots of problems, right? We don't have enough technical resources. There's not enough understanding. There's not adequate infrastructure. Let's build it in the easy places, right? All these people want to go to the toughest places and implement blockchain. So I have some military background. I spent a number of years in Army infantry and intelligence, and a lot of people think that that's an oxymoron. But in my case, it's true, especially in the Army, which is where I was. But we wouldn't take green troops and put them into the heaviest fighting, right? You go through training, and there's a process to harden troops. And we need to harden blockchain. And we need to do it in a way that really makes sense. So it's very eclectic all over the world, and our strategy ought to be go for the easy stuff.
I think that's great advice, and we're trying to figure out what that means at all layers of government, in a thoughtful way. And I'll pivot over to Silvio, who both in his activity in the private sector and the founding of his company, and now in his work down with Florida, is literally seeing, the private sector and now the government in trying to get a government initiative up and running. So I can kind of want to get your take on what that experience has been like, what have been some of the lessons learned in trying to move this at a local government level.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I appreciate that, and really appreciate your story, Gerard, of like, hey, everything's fine. We want to apply it across the board, except in this part. This is just what we wanted. Yeah, I think that actually really resonates, right? What I've seen is there's a bit of a sandwich effect. Like the federal government has like been really interested, and they're like calling on us to volunteer for our opinions, to get together, to chat. Central banks have also, like, I think I got first flown out 5 years ago to central banks, but they were also like really quiet about it. The state, on the other hand, was like, for the most part, like, okay, cool, maybe, I don't know, maybe let's look like we're doing something. But the local governments, the mayors particularly, I think are the ones that can see the most to gain immediately from doing something. And I think it goes to Gerard's point, which is like, where's the easier place to implement? And like I mentioned in the panel that I was talking about earlier, unfortunately, sometimes when you are at the municipal level, you do need to go back to the state level to push on legislation to let you do what you need to do at a local level. For example, if we want to work with, I know we got the Government Blockchain Association now, we're doing like a Earth ID for our own ID management system. If you would like to do that in a place like Florida, we would need to interconnect with the DMV. It doesn't matter how much Mayor Daniela want to do it at Miami-Dade County, or it doesn't matter how much Mayor Francis Suarez wants to do it in the city of Miami. If you don't have a DMV integration, it can't be done. So that would be, in a perfect world, maybe the first thing you should do that enables a number of other things, but it's not as easy to do, unless you have that multi-layer approach. When we originally met, and I think 4 years ago, thanks to Jordan, when we walked over, we were talking about the smart city project in Miami. We were talking about, all right, maybe like if I would be developing a smart city project, I'd start with energy to create like a distributed mesh network and resilient network in case you have an EMP or whatever it is go off. Do you have a resilient infrastructure designed? But in Florida, and I should have prefaced it like you guys, all these opinions are my own. In Florida, we have the 800-pound gorilla, which is NextEra Energy, which is Florida Power and Light. And so you have a lot of like tricky legislation that happens there. So it's like you can't, it's like that is not the road less traveled. You do not want to go there and poke the bear. So he said, okay, well, let's then look at supply chain. 4 out of every 10 jobs are supply chain in Florida, believe it or not. And so we said, okay, well, let's look at supply chain. But when we talk to like the ports of Atlanta, for example, I know Randy did a lot of work to talk to the Port Authority is like, no. Yes, thanks, but no thanks, right? Go figure, right? And so even if the port said yes to wanting to do a project, then you have to go back, let's say, to maybe GSA. And then I'd have to maybe apply to the GSA to be approved as a vendor, and then maybe get like a federal ID to then apply also at a local level. So it gets really tricky very quickly. Even with people giving guidance, it's still like kind of murky. And so at that level, let's say you do want to create a smart cargo system or a smart port system. We have no smart ports in the US, by the way. We have no smart infrastructure, really very little smart infrastructure. But there are places that are really poised to do it. So 4 years later, we still have not been able to do a public-private partnership. Go figure. And I don't know if it's because Miami, like Atlanta, and places like Vegas are like number 1, 2, and 3 for human trafficking, for example, right? Huge issue. If you had blockchain and smart systems that can maybe support some of this, it wouldn't be as much of an issue. But also at the same time, like Gerard was mentioning, maybe you don't really want that technology to expose what's truly happening. And assuming they did, then we would have to have an integration with the federal and state. Florida Department of Transportation, Federal Department of Transportation, Customs and Border Protection. If we want to be able to use artificial intelligence to know what the food quality is that's coming into Miami in the refrigeration, then we need to have an integration with the USDA. So there is not very singularly hyper-local examples and easy wins that are so evident, right? Like to get it done, right? We can get into other examples, but I'll take a pause there.
Yeah, and
Can I tag on something just real quick? I think that's exactly why. And by the way, do you guys enjoy having something like, these are brilliant people that we have in our midst, aren't they? So I just met Paul today, right? But when I met these guys, I was just blown away by how smart they are. But that complexity, that interconnection, right, is one of the reasons why I think adoption in the United States is so slow, right? And we're going to have a talk later by the co-author of an act in Liechtenstein. So Liechtenstein is much smaller. They established a blockchain, cryptocurrency blockchain framework about 2 years ago, and in a place like Liechtenstein, they could just do it like that, right? So going back to the easy point, you've got to find places that are as independent as possible and not as interconnected, right? But I thought that was a brilliant point, Paul. I mean, Silvio.
And I'm glad it tied into one of the themes I was hoping we'd really get at. And that's why we have countries like El Salvador who really see these as opportunities to grow and to birth these things. And then you have other countries like China and hopefully the US in maintaining leadership in this. It's a bit of a different calculus. And I should also say these views are my own and not necessarily representative of Mr. Soto or the Future Forum. That there are inherent challenges, and Florida has a lot of benefits too. For example, we were talking about ag right before this panel, and 1/3 of the food supply comes through the Port of Miami. So that's a huge logistical challenge. And while we want to make sure these, and I agree with the assessment that a lot of these innovations are going to occur internationally, and you see Latin American and African countries really investing aggressively because they see these as leapfrog technologies. Not only technologies that will allow you to catch up, but literally, leapfrog some other countries. So I think, and I'll pivot back to Paul. He's probably a little nervous because he doesn't know where I'm going with this. But with a country like the U.S., it's incredibly important, such huge stakes for getting it wrong. So there's always a balance of speed of bills or regulation and clarity while there's this pressure, but the consequences are kind of huge if you don't dial up the metrics correctly. So you worked on probably the preeminent commodities bill to be introduced, or I'll say though that Paul's modest.
Thanks.
That is really leading the way for defining exchanges and exchange clarity in this country. Sorry. And so I could kind of just, as a broad question, some of the challenges and some of the pressure and what are some of the dials that you turn to make sure you're balancing those kind of competing variables?
Sure, it's a good question. And I think it relates kind of to the same things we've been talking about here, right? We have in this country very established systems, and I think we can all find places where they don't work as well as they would like. Largely they work, and largely they work fairly well. And so there's a lot of sort of institutional buy-in to the way in which things work in this country, and a lot of folks are comfortable with the processes that we have. So every time somebody comes along and says, I have a bag of magic beans and I'm going to reinvent how we do these things, that's a real challenge for the folks that are very comfortable with how we do things today. And financial regulation is the place where I work at the Ag Committee. Sort of maybe surprising to everyone here why someone from the Ag Committee is here, but we have oversight over the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and most of the nation's derivatives markets. So that's sort of how I come at this discussion. And clearly we have two very well-established financial market regulators in this country, this Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And both those agencies are stocked with very smart people, and they have 100 years of law that they have applied, and case law and sort of history that helps them, and they have used to sort through financial markets and decide sort of how we regulate things. And so as we look at swaps, I think we sort of started with swaps, right? Swaps was a great example. we didn't know how to treat swaps 40 years ago, and there was a disagreement between the CFTC and the SEC about who should have jurisdiction over them, and much like we're sort of facing with crypto today, that's because we have rules and sort of institutions that have built up over time. So as we think about how to integrate new things into them, you got to start from where we are, right? And so we're in a place where you have financial regulators, and that's the starting place. And sort of similar as we talk about port security and every other thing that we may want to do, you start from where you're at, and then sort of figure out how to go from there. I'll pause there.
No, that's hugely helpful and insightful, and I think I'm just thinking a lot of these big picture questions. So I'm gonna let Gerard wax poetically, and I'm just kind of intrigued. We're trying to answer a lot of these big picture questions, and a lot of these insights are very helpful. But even like how you undertook the Herculean task of starting your own association and all the background work that you do, like what even got you into this? How did you get the blockchain bug, and what are some of the things that excite you most about as this evolves?
Well, so I had another career. I was traveling all over the world evaluating companies to see if they were mature enough to win large government contracts. And I told you that I had a background in Army infantry and intelligence. It was odd. I started getting calls from China asking me to come out and evaluate Chinese defense contractors on behalf of its Chinese government. Does that seem weird to any of you? Right? So I said, listen, you do know that I'm a former United States Army intelligence professor? And they said, yes, no, we actually know a lot about you. I said, that's very comforting for me to know. But we have it on good account that you can't be bribed. So a little bit of backstory, integrity is a really important thing to me. At the time, my son had just bought a little bit of Bitcoin, and when I say a little bit, I mean under $5. And we sold it. He paid for a car, a motorcycle, his college tuition, and his living expenses, right? And I hated him. Right. Now this was at the very, very beginning, right? Nobody really knew anything, and so I kind of got my attention, and so blockchain was a secret sauce. So he held a meetup, and nobody really kind of cared about this in the early days, right? But what was a driver for the internet was email, because everybody wanted an email address. But to get an email address, you need an ISP. Well, once you had an ISP, you could have a web page, and once you had a web page, we're off to the races, right? You can find a wife, you can jump into a stranger's car, go to a stranger's house, sleep in their bed, and then I'm just not, wherever that goes, swipe right, swipe left. Our whole life changed, right? Social media, right? But it was email that drove that for the internet, right? Well, it's cryptocurrency that is driving that for blockchain, right? And I remember in the early days, the sophisticated people in government said, talk to me about blockchain, but don't just talk to me about crypto. That's scammy, stuff. But quite frankly, healthcare, supply chain, blockchain, it wasn't moving anything. It just wasn't. And it wasn't until the ups and downs and all the craziness. Now, Jovan, is Jovan in here? Yeah. So Jovan is basically leads all of our global operations, right? And by the way, thank you for the incredible work you do. GBA's got 120 chapters around the world, and Jovan's been instrumental in building and maintaining that. But he shared with me an article earlier, and what does it say that Biden is attempting to? Is it outlaw crypto, or what was the detail of that? An executive order about significantly reducing, whether it's illegal or whatever, having a tamping down effect on crypto. Well, he also shared with me that Russia tried to do the same thing, and it was defeated by the House internally. And if a centrally planned government like Moscow, like Russia, can't get it through, right? Crypto has become pretty ubiquitous here in the United States, right? I don't know what the current numbers are, but I would not be surprised if 20, 30% of people don't own crypto, at least some. They've all heard about it. I mean, it's on the evening news, right? So the government's gonna have a very, very hard time tamping down on it. The genie's out of the bottle. Now, here's why it's important to the cities. Cities can't print their own money, right? When the pandemic hit in March of 2020, in March of 2020, the total number of dollars in circulation was $4 trillion. 1 year later, the total number of circulation, 18 trillion. Because the government said we got to shut down the economy. Well, people still need to eat. We got to pay them. Let's do all these stimulus things. Well, it's not like they had bags of money. You guys in Congress, you didn't have bags of money sitting in some.
Oh, I do under my desk.
Oh, you do? Okay. We've got to become better friends. Yeah. I just met you today. That's just not fair. But and the government's already in debt. So what do? They told the banks, "Well, go ahead and just loan out more money." They dropped the fractional reserve requirement to 0. So now all of a sudden, the federal government can do this, the states and the cities, they can't. So the government starts essentially devaluing the economy. The banks don't need your deposits anymore. So what happened to the interest rates of the bank? They plummeted, right? Who needs your deposits for liquidity? The exchanges. So the exchanges started offering 5 to 30%, while the banks were offering 0. Where do you think all that money, where do you think all the savings went? Into the exchanges. The actual number of people that own crypto is much larger than I think most people realize. And so now you've got the folks at the national level trying to control the national economy. All of this stuff is happening, and Bill will tell you, Paul, you may know too, the folks on Capitol Hill don't have a clue as to what's happening.
It's getting better, but it's
well, because of your education and leadership. But I think it's...
I'd plug the blockchain caucus. It's
okay.
And I'm a part of that.
Yeah, I know you're a part of that, but you're here. But so this thing is running out fast, and the reason why places like El Salvador and Miami are running through this is because the U.S. dollar is hurting. And when we devalued the dollar, we didn't just do that to people in America. 65% of all foreign reserves are in U.S. dollars, right? So I was on a conference call with folks from Pakistan, and they basically call this economic imperialism. We are essentially making them poorer, so they're looking for alternatives. Well, where are they going to look? Right? China, Russia, right? And any other national fiat currency's got the same problem. They're looking at crypto. So we are on the precipice of a massive change happening. And quite frankly, I think that the reason why we're seeing all this activity at the federal level is because now they're realizing too many crickets, this is real. Right? The banks tried to tamp it down and said it was all just scam money. Now what are they doing? Look, if you can't beat them, join them. Mm-hmm. Right? So now the national government is looking at what the banks are doing, and what about private companies? Right? We're not far from Michael Saylor's place. We had invited him to come. He wasn't able to schedule it. But how much did he put in his treasury? Right? I don't know. I think it's like $1 billion or something. So the corporations are doing it. All of this stuff is happening. And the national government in the United States is trying to keep up, but it's running out way ahead of them. And it's Miami, Florida, these places are leading. So anyway, I'm sorry, I monopolized the...
No, and I think we started about 5 minutes late, so okay. So I'll ask Silvio. It's going to be a quick question, and then we'll do a concluding thought, down the line. So you mentioned some of your pain points and kind of shifting from the private sector, and now you've kind of seen government can be a very deliberative, AKA slow process sometimes. So I'd be interested to hear the other side, some of your positive lessons learned, and if you could maybe just limit to like a minute and a half, and just some of your things you were pleasantly surprised with when you started working with governments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for sure, there are a few leaders that really see and are willing to step out of the comfort zone towards what the promise of innovation can bring to the masses, right? And so somebody that's really coming at this from the private sector, honestly, I don't have enough of an incentive to put as much effort and energy into like trying to help the government. But it's not about the government, it's about the us. It's about the people. It's about the kids I grew up with. It's about the people that don't have a seat at the table, right? And that really is what continues to be my inspiration. And every so often, I come across other leaders in government that really appreciate that and still share that original ethos of why people go into policy and government to begin with. And then they want it. They'll call out for it. They'll call me. They'll text me. They'll ask me to come out. They'll ask me to hold a sunshine meeting. They'll say, how do you help with this? How do you help with that? And so that process has been really encouraging. And now, more specifically, 4 years later, finally we're getting a chance to say, hey, look, this is all the other things that we have worked on so far to get to this point, and finally getting the calls from our own local community to ask, okay, well, what else can we do? And finally feel that it is the right time, that it's not just, hitting the wall anymore. There can be a way forward. So I feel more motivated than ever and more inspired than ever, especially with the recent leadership that we've had, especially in the county and the whole crypto task force, and the fact that, and the collaboration, right, that it opens up, because when there's not enough of a knowledge and understanding of what's possible, and we can really come to the table with something that is truly innovative and has depth and meaning and meat to it, then I think there's a lot more that can be accomplished, and there is a silver lining, I think, because government getting involved is the leverage point, ultimately, that will free the masses, right? And that really continues to be my inspiration.
Well, that's great to hear, and you need a lot of motivation for keeping up with this dynamic ecosystem. Crypto never sleeps. So we'll wrap up. We'll give each panelist 1 minute to either, what is a project or that you're most excited about, or a piece of advice you would give, our great audience out there as they start to engage with government. Like, what's a pearl of wisdom you'd have to offer?
I'll go first. All right. Bill alluded to it earlier. One of the things that we're working on at the House Ag Committee is trying to think about how to integrate crypto into financial markets, right, and to bring some more clarity to when things are securities and under the jurisdiction of the SEC, and when things are not securities and theoretically commodities, and what that regulatory regime should look like. I think there's a lot of folks that have felt the pain of being under the SEC's watchful eye. And part of that is because there is a lot of fraud and there is a lot of malfeasance in crypto markets. And so, as we think about regulation and how to regulate the marketplaces where people may meet to buy and sell these things, we think that there is a need to, while things shouldn't necessarily all be considered securities, that there is still a need to have investor protections and be able to protect people who are trading in those trading venues while still permitting them to take those away from the venues and use them as we would imagine people use crypto. Your second question, you got to come in and talk to us. I think that's by far the most important thing. Come in and talk and be patient and help us understand what you're doing, and don't be afraid to meet with staff. And I think we have a lot of folks that are very eager to learn and are very, very willing to take meetings, but it starts with folks reaching out to them because they don't know who you are and how to reach you.
Great segue. Paul, are you learning anything here?
A little bit, yeah.
Good. Well,
I don't know everything, as it turns out.
no. I would like to encourage members of the Blockchain Caucus to engage with us, and even potentially, I think it'd be great if we could even do a course, right? Do a one-day course for a congressional staff, or 1 or 2 day course. I'd like to make that publicly available. In your brochure, there's a couple QR codes. I would say one of them is to our newsletter. So we have 50 working groups, and so you asked about some of the projects we're excited about. We're working on something called it's just too many. The blockchain maturity model, right? Our credit union project, our voting and elections project, sustainability. There's so many. One of our working groups is putting on an event in May at the Mayflower Hotel. We have, I think, 5 or 7 ballrooms, 12 breakout sessions, 3 floors of the Mayflower Hotel for 3 days. And one of our 50 groups is essentially planning that event, right? We're launching media platforms. There's just too much. But if you hit that QR code and subscribe to our newsletter, you'll start finding out about all these things, and then you can connect with the ones that make sense to you. And then the only other thing I'd like to say is I'd just like to thank all you guys for just the incredible work that you do.
It's awesome. One pearl of wisdom from you, Silvio, and then we'll bring it in for a landing.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely would start, and I know we got to be quick about this, but I think there's really an important opportunity with a project we're working on right now called Sustain Cities for taking smart cities a step further towards climate accounting. So the U.S. just got back into the United Nations Paris Climate Accord, and the ultimate game. I mean, sort of like how much crypto we have, how much money we have, what the social status is completely irrelevant unless we sort of meet this global goal of the Sustainable Development Goals, and get our environmental game a bit together. Not to be an environmentalist per se, right, but just to say what is actually happening. We don't know enough about what's happening. So Smart Sustainable Cities is focused on creating partnerships with cities. We want to do it across the U.S., across the world, 10,000 cities with the United Nations. And it's creating a smart city, offering smart city as a service. So being able to finance the hardware and the sensors so people have a baseline. Then climate accounting as a service, which could be open source, an open source way to let other universities and others be involved to find out what is actually happening in the environment, in the air quality, the water quality, temperature, heat, et cetera, to have the data to make the decisions and then sort of correlate anything else that's happening. And then ultimately moving towards net zero as a service, right? How do we, lowering greenhouse gases or emissions for different governments at different levels, whether it's state, local, et cetera. But all these things have to nest within each other. So I finally have an excuse to use all the relationships up and down the ladder for international, national, regional, state, and local under this nested accounting system. And that's why we want to have this inter-alliance of municipalities agree so that we can have a data sharing that starts with something as altruistic as just the environment. No competitive advantage of hoarding your environmental data, in one way or another. So I think that's what I'm most proud of. And the projects that we're working on right now, but like Gerard said, there's 50 that are more relevant, depending on the audience member. And the nugget of wisdom is, research, stay curious, stay hungry, be okay with failure, and just to keep at it, honestly. So stay hungry, stay foolish.
Well, thank you so much. I'll add my own. Again, this is a completely personal prediction, but if you don't know what a data oracle is, I'd give that a Google. And just some of the really cool applications, I think that, to my mind, I didn't know what it was until a few years ago, and I interact with a lot of crypto and blockchain folks, and sort of had a internal limitation that's like, well, maybe this is going to be hard to scale because you have to have all the data on chain. Mm-hmm. And that goes right back to the problem of centralized data. It's like, what are we solving if you have to have all your data on chain where only a few companies, because it's very resource intensive. And so this is just my own personal prediction, but data oracles are what you can have a separate pocket of data that will interact with a smart contract or a blockchain that allows you to develop a protocol or a solution without having to have the whole data set yourself. So when we get trusted sources of data, whether they're, the DMV or something that they could, use an identity layer or whatever, as somebody in the ecosystem here, a lot of different folks, when I learned what a data oracle, it sort of got me really excited because it solves some of the scalability issues that we're currently facing. So I suggest you give it a Google and go down that rabbit hole. And the word of advice I would have is just to realize we're people. I think we're all incredibly excited by these things. But these are passion projects. There aren't a lot of layers of government that are. So instead of expressing all your frustration with what isn't perfect, I think we have to be very encouraging and patient with those people that are just coming on board. Seek out leaders in the space, but also be willing to be a translator for those that don't know. And I'll just conclude, well, I'll just say that you have to be ready to meet people where they're ready to have a conversation. You know, if they ask you a question about crypto or whatever and it's very elementary, you got to be willing to talk to them because they're literally reaching out to you as somebody that knows more. You know, a lot of condescending comments or crypto Twitter, you know, kind of, I think that kills a lot of enthusiasm, and would just really, really encourage that the cooperative, you know, kumbaya stuff is what really matters right now.
Amen. 100%.